Hello, and welcome to the Argument and Theory Podcast, a podcast dedicated to argumentation theory and the studies of the humanities in general. Today, I have on Associate Professor of Communications, Steve Llano from St. John's University, joining us from Queens, New York. Dr. Llano specializes in the theory, criticism, and pedagogy of rhetoric. Join us today while we discuss rhetorical theory, political discourse, and video games. You can contact Dr. Llano at his email, llanos@stjohns.edu. Welcome, Dr. Llano. I'm really excited to have you on the podcast. This is the third episode, and we've had a very long break between the second and the third one. So, okay, the first question is, how does it feel to be the first rhetorician on the podcast?
Oh, I didn't know I was the first rhetorician. That's great. It feels great. Yeah, I've been studying rhetoric for quite a while, so it's good. I had a podcast for a while. It's kind of like fades in and out of existence, but it was about intercollegiate debate. I got to talk about rhetoric on there, but I haven't been on a podcast in a long time. So it's it's a good pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Can you name the podcast if people want to check that out?
Oh yeah, sure. It's called In the Bin, BIN, In the Bin, and it was a podcast about intercollegiate debate, international intercollegiate debate. Ran it for years, and then as I got out of intercollegiate debate, it kind of faded, but it kind of faded before then too. Then in the pandemic, it kind of came back for a little bit because everybody's looking for stuff to do in the pandemic, and so people kind of needled me. They're like, "You should bring it back. We could have bigger issues, talk about the bigger issues in debate." I thought about doing that, and I did that. I did a few episodes of it coming back, and that was pretty good. But then kind of faded away again. But I'm always thinking about bringing it back.
Yeah, well, let me know. I was watching it for a while, so I'd be excited to see that.
All right, another Ben fan.
Yeah.
Love it.
Can you distinguish how the word rhetoric is used in everyday speech from the way that it's used in communication studies and English studies?
Yeah, I can do that. So I think most people, if you're not in academia and you don't read the stuff that we read, you would think of rhetoric as dishonest speech or empty speech. I think that's the way it's used in the media quite a bit. So, for example, we just had Donald Trump in his first few days, and a lot of media sources are saying, well, is Donald Trump, all of his campaign rhetoric, is he actually going to do something, or is this all just campaign rhetoric? Or he's trying to show that he's actually going to follow through on his rhetoric. So it's this oppositional that gets created a lot of times by the media, but by a lot of people, to say rhetoric is meaningless words or empty words without any force behind them, without any meaning behind them, or without any intent or any kind of promise, or unethical words. And that's what most people encounter. Then there's this other level of rhetoric, which is the study of how to make words pretty, which is a lot of old writing pedagogy was like this, like how to write. And you still see some of this. Like some of my colleagues are still like, I don't think students can write an appropriate cover letter. So it has to like look a certain way, feel a certain way, have a certain kind of vibe to it, as the kids would say. So it's this kind of like study of making words beautiful and making words look appropriate, look nice for their situation. And that's still kind of around, but that's kind of the old view of it. In the rhetoric I was trained in, speech comm rhetoric, we have this tradition, but it is a little different than in composition rhetoric. In composition rhetoric, it was like writing modalities. So you need to be able to write a persuasive essay, a descriptive essay. You need to be able to do some business writing. You need to be able to compare, contrast, like all these kind of old exercises. You go pick up an old pre 1965 book, hopefully not much later than that, for writing. It'll have all these different things in it about how to do these kind of essays. And in my field, we had a similar thing. Well, we still do it in public speaking. We still teach all these modalities, like after dinner speech, the forensic speech, the informative speech, the persuasive speech, the how-to speech. We just teach these modalities. There's nothing much behind them other than get the form right. So that's still that's much more with speech comm than it is with writing. And then there's this other level of rhetoric, which is the level of studying how people collectively or independently form meaning out of things, whether they're symbolic or maybe not symbolic. So, how do we get meaning out of stuff? And how do we agree and disagree upon meanings? And how do we know that we found the right meaning for something? Or how do we know we found the wrong meaning? And that's what I understand rhetoric to be. For a very long time, rhetoric in my field was just the words of important men, emphasis on men, emphasis on important, like presidential rhetoric
Mhm.
dominated for a long time in speech com rhetoric was just like study the words of the presidents. So it was like, I did some of this in college. It's like, okay, we're going to study inaugural speeches. We're going to study State of the Union speeches. We're going to study speeches of crisis or speeches of war, farewell speeches. I just did a YouTube video on Biden's farewell, just kind of as a throwback to kind of what, what I was trained to do in undergrad.
Mhm.
But now I don't think a lot of this is done anymore. And now rhetoric is about how do we speak about and change or think about the meanings of things. A big one is race. Another big one is gender. So in my field, people are talking about how are these things determined and how can they be changed, altered? How do people come to understand gender? How do people come to understand race as something that's not an interpretable choice, but as this real thing? So that's kind of where we are today. That's a real quick and very fast kind of history of it and how it comes to be. And in writing studies, they have another angle that we don't do in speech com rhetoric, which is this kind of study of voice. We don't really have a concept like voice
Mhm.
like you do in writing studies. And I
Oh,
think
that's
that comes
interesting.
from writing studies. Yeah, yeah, right. I think it's interesting because, like, I can't imagine if I went to a bunch of public speaking teachers and be like, "How do you teach voice?" They'd be like, "What?" Like they wouldn't understand the question
Mhm.
because we're so embroiled in modality. But in writing studies, I think modality's gone out the window, and it's much more of like, how can I get student voice to? How can I get the students to say in a way that reaches and constructs realities with the people reading it in different ways? Like it's very, very intense and very deep, and almost kind of like hypodermic in a way. Like let's really get in there. I used to describe writing studies as like making these little dioramas, like out of a box, and you kind of look in. Like we used to do this in elementary school. You
Yeah.
look and you see this whole scene, and I'm like, this is really kind of cool. I really like the concept of voice. We don't have it, but I think there's a lot of stuff written on voice and about voice in also the mirror image of voice, which is ideas about like, when you ask students for clarity, what are you asking them to do? You're asking them to write like a white person. A lot of times that happens. That's not very good.
Mhm.
What is a good, what is good tone? Like a lot of these things are kind of like through voice, you get these kind of nice critiques of grammar and like how authentic can your voice be and what is authentic voice look like? I think these are all really interesting questions, but we do not entertain them.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's interesting. I would not, I'm very surprised that you don't talk about voice too much in speech communication studies. Now, I'm
Mm-hmm.
happy you brought up race and gender. I think the impression a lot of people get about what it means to study compositional rhetoric or the teaching of writing is like, what are all the grammar rules and how do you teach the grammar rules?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But uh, really, that was a small minority, if we talked about that at all. A lot of it was focused on the social and political um, context that people come from that they're writing in. Yeah, so yeah, no, writing like a white person. I'm happy you brought that up because that's something we talked about a lot too. And I don't know, it does seem a little racist for academia to be like, you need to write, you need to write according to this style, and it's basically very similar to how a lot of white people speak, and it's very significantly different in a lot of ways from how like people who speak African American
Mm-hmm.
vernacular English speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also, there's lots of things about like class discipline and things like that. And it is kind of a fraught issue because a lot of people do see education as a way out of poverty, a way to fight back kind of institutional oppression. Look, I can communicate just as well as you can. I can communicate appropriately. I'm not disadvantaged in these ways, and so it's important to teach these kind of things because it's like an incredibly powerful tool. But at the same time, if you only teach those things, then you're kind of replicating the system of power that's just going to hold people down who don't get those opportunities again. So there has to be some intervention that the teaching of composition, the teaching of rhetoric does in terms of acceptability and audience. So we're always kind of, we should be, if we're teaching it well, we should always be kind of pushing the envelope for like taste and saying, well, you might think this is like I do in my, like this is a speech class. You might think there's like some special way to give a speech, and there is. And that special way to give a speech is to be in tune and connect with the audience. Connecting with the audience is the most important thing. And sometimes that is violating their expectations of what they think a speech should look like. Like Bakhtin is very, Mikhail Bakhtin had lots of theories about this, the heteroglossic language, dialogized heteroglossia, which he said was the power of the novel, which is where you can make a character speak the inappropriate or the wrong kind of language to somebody. And then you get all these different they have a conversation about it, and they really can't understand each other, but the reader gets this amazing look into the different ways we talk and the power and the politics and the assumptions that come behind it. And that was what fascinated him. But we kind of talk, we can kind of talk about that in our rhetoric work of like, if I intentionally violate the expectations of an audience, that might be a powerful move to make to get them to get a connection with them, get them to understand me in a deeper way than just understanding like denotatively what I've written or what I'm saying. They understand it in this very different, very rich way. Like I really liked that, but that really wasn't the right way to talk about economics or whatever your speech is about.
That's interesting. Yeah, I need to read Bakhtin. I have one of his texts. I haven't gotten to it yet though, but people keep mentioning him. Got to get to that.
Yeah, Bakhtin is really kind of picked up in like, how has he been picked up? He might be coming back around again, but for a while he was pretty popular. But he was really, really popular in like Latin American studies because of his theory of carnival. So you saw a lot of that in like critical Latinx studies. I saw a lot of Bakhtin for a long time, but I don't really know. I haven't really looked at Bakhtin stuff. I don't know how he's being picked up, but I did hear at NCA a couple of years ago, really, really bad interpretation of Bakhtin.
Oh
So
no.
people are trying. Oh, it's terrible. Yeah.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, me too. I was sorry to hear it too.
Uh, um, okay. Okay, here.
Yeah.
Okay, here are three words I wanted you to quickly distinguish. Rhetoric, rhetorician, and rhetor.
Okay, very good. So I think rhetoric. So we can go back. We can do a little etymology, a little ancient Greek etymology. So we have this word that appears in many different. So ancient Greek is a funny thing to study because we have a finite set of documents and no new ones are being produced. Occasionally, somebody will find like a box in the mud of some river bottom and it has a bunch of papyri in it. And they're like, oh, are these new Greek texts? And oftentimes they're copies of ones we already have. But then you compare those to the ones we have at Oxford, which are the official ones. Da, da, da. So one of the weird things about ancient Greek is you can go through an ancient Greek lexicon and find how many times a word has been used in all the texts that survive from ancient Greek. So some words are very common, some words are not very common. So one of them is very, very common is this word rhetoros, which is an ancient Greek word, and it just means a speaker or an orator. We might translate it orator, rhetoros. And the first time that we know of where this word is not nominative, where it's a thing instead of a person, is in Plato's work. So even though Plato is very much against rhetoric, and he has Socrates make all these arguments about how rhetoric is faulty, it's not an art, it doesn't have enough oomph to really teach us anything. It's more of a knack or a fun kind of ability. Like everyone can learn how to paint, but if someone's good at rhetoric and they're good at painting, then it's easier for them to teach. It's just kind of this extra thing. And that's the ancient Greek word rhetoric, which we would say is rhetoric, or it's rhetoric as a thing. And this appears in Plato for the first time that we know of from the surviving texts. So that's a big difference there is it's kind of radical for Socrates to say, yeah, I get what rhetoros is. I get what being a good speaker is, but what is the study of speech? And it's this kind of interruption where it becomes a subject matter rather than what Socrates thinks it should be, which is the way in which we teach and study subjects. And that's it. Like it's not an end in itself. It's not something we should study. So rhetoric is sort of the study of all of these different speeches, different media, different ways that people put meaning, symbolism, or communication into the world, and how we fight about those things. So even people do rhetoric of urban spaces. So I've talked to some of these people, and they talk about how a building in a skyline will quote another building. Like an architect will be quoting another building somewhere in the world in their design. And I'm like, that's such a weird way to think about it. I never thought about that before. So that's highly rhetorical. So a rhetorician is somebody who studies rhetoric or teaches it. I would say that's the modern understanding of that. Is a rhetorician is somebody who might not create rhetoric. They might not create these kind of texts, but they study, they do rhetorical criticism or other kinds of criticism where they talk about the various meanings. And unlike other kinds of scholarship, I think rhetorical scholarship is unusual because a lot of times people look at the university and they say, oh, what they're trying to do is get to the truth of it and reduce it down to the true meaning and dismiss false meanings, take those into account, dismiss, and boil it down to where we get the actual meaning of something. We slice it down. But rhetorical criticism doesn't really work that way. It kind of explodes it. It goes the other direction. So it's like, look at all these potential and possible meanings that could be in this text that were not identified in the conversation so far. So really, we're kind of muddying things up. Rhetoricians kind of muddy things up and put a lot of dust in the air instead of narrowing things down and kind of reducing them. So I think that's kind of a funny thing. It's a little bit different than what people might expect. So good rhetorical criticism might say, well, here's all the possibilities, what it could mean. It's like if you think about the January 6th commission, where they're really, really trying very hard to make the case that Donald Trump's speech incited the riot. This was like the whole contentious thing about January 6th. Did he do this? Are his words culpable? They're using a framework of this kind of reduction down to like, this means this and this triggers this. It was kind of this very legal framework of getting down to the exact definitions. But if they had used some rhetorical theory, they might have had a better case because they can say, look at how these words encourage these kinds of identification. Look at how these words have these other potential meanings that a crowd that diverse in nature, but not diverse in value or diverse in purpose would interpret. They might have had a better way of sort of making the case that his rhetoric was irresponsible or meant to do that. And, you can make that argument too stronger from making it a broader sense of meaning rather than narrowing it down. So I think it's kind of a mistake for Liz Cheney and them to try to do it that way. And that's the kind of work rhetoricians would do. It doesn't really get out into the population that much, which is kind of frustrating. It doesn't get into the popular press. Very frustrating. I remember being at a conference last summer, and a scholar there was expressing frustration to me that you can go into a bookstore and there's a history section, and there are working academic historians writing popular books about history, like professor of history at Tulane or professor of history at wherever, but there's no rhetoric section. there's like how to speak quick in business to, some like guy with capped teeth and a suit on the cover, but there's not like a rhetoric section. It's kind of frustrating. And if you do find a book about rhetoric, it'll be like why Martin Luther King is a great speaker. And it'll just be like by some like Yahoo guy who like works in a company and is an entrepreneur and just kind of talks about his opinion about Martin Luther King with no theory or nothing rhetorical behind it. Very frustrating. And I was like, yeah, that is frustrating. So that's what being a rhetorician is, kind of being frustrated, I guess. And making other people frustrated because you go and try to read a work to see what Bill Clinton meant by this speech or what Obama meant. It's like, look at all these potential ways to read it. And it actually kind of adds more questions than it really answers. I think that's what good rhetorical criticism does.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last one was rhetor, right? That's the last word. And that still has that Greek meaning for us, which is the speaker. But a rhetor could also be, we have a broader definition now, because a rhetor could also be an institution, or it could be a scene. And then, a big controversy. A lot of people don't think it should be a controversy is images and films could be rhetor. So an image could be the rhetor. Like, what is this image presenting to us? And I think as you move across a spectrum of like advertising or to something like art, like Van Gogh's Cypress paintings are on my mind. Because like I went to the Met Museum in New York a couple of weeks ago, and Those paintings are always there and they're always very interesting. So if you say this painting is the rhetor, people will be like, don't you mean Van Gogh? And we'd say, well, Van Gogh's not really around. You know, the author is kind of dead in a very real way, but also symbolically.
Yeah.
And maybe even Van Gogh's interpretation of what he's doing might not be the one that people would agree with when they're viewing the painting. They may say, well, that's what he saw or that's what he tried to do, but I'm getting this message from this. And so there's controversy about that because some people will be like, well, an image can't really be a rhetor. Is that really speaking? But a skyline or maybe even a car design. But I think as you move closer into advertising or political cartoons, people are a lot more willing to accept those things as rhetoric and maybe not so much art or images or film. You know, but I mean, David Lynch just passed away. At the time we're recording this, he passed away a few days ago. David Lynch's films are very like tempting to rhetoricians to go and study and say, what does this symbol mean and what does this mean? And people really get into those in you know, Twin Peaks and all this stuff. There's a lot written about it out there, but people would say, well, that's properly film studies. So maybe the study of rhetoric could also be like a method that people in different studies bring in. So you could be working in a critical race department, or you could be working in a history department or any such thing. And rhetoric could be a method that you take on.
Yeah, something you highlighted at the end that I think maybe is undervalued sometimes is that rhetoric is applicable to every field. It's its
Mhm.
own field within itself, but it's also applicable to every field as well because we use symbols all the time. Almost everything we do is through symbols. Um, and the rhetoric is how to manage that.
Yeah. And it's also this idea of like when people try to say something is a symbol or isn't a symbol. So we have this great recent controversy that's meta on this level with Elon Musk. Did Elon Musk make a Nazi salute at the inauguration? So some people are like, oh, that's a dangerous, horrible symbol, and he should be punished for that. And some people are saying it's not a symbol at all. He was just excited, or it's not a symbol at all. He's autistic. People are making that defense,
Yeah, I
and
heard
I
that
just
through
think
other
it's
people.
yeah, it's a strange, but it's the kind of thing that rhetoricians study because you look at it and you're like, it's strange because to most people, you look at that and they're like, that's pretty clearly a Nazi salute. And to think of someone like Elon Musk not being aware of what that looked like or that people could interpret it that way, even if he didn't mean it, and it would be wise not to do it, is shocking. But that's what rhetoricians study. Be like, okay, why is that interpretation shocking? That's interesting. Why is that?
Mhm.
Why is his defense as weird as it is to people? That says something about appropriateness, audience, context, and the way symbols have been used before in history, and you can't really escape from that. So I think that's a great example of what you're talking about there, right? This idea of symbols and the fight about symbols. Because sometimes the rhetoric is like, well, no, that's not a symbol at all. I didn't mean it to be a symbol. I was just excited. Right? Interesting, right?
Yeah, yeah. Now, if people were to say something like that, like that's not what I intended.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you say something and you hurt someone's feelings, even if you didn't mean it, you still hurt their feelings. So,
That's right.
that message was still communicated
Mm-hmm.
regardless of the intention. So the intention is valuable, but um that it's not fully contingent. The message is not fully contingent on the intention of the author.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely right. Yeah. One of the things that's shocking to new students, and I'm like, when we're doing speech analysis, intent really doesn't matter. So they'll go and find research like like a student looking at Hillary Clinton's campaign announcement. And then in her book about running for president, she talks about what she was trying to do. And I'm like, that is actually not privileged information about the speech. Student very confused. I'm like, that's actually her interpretation of her own speech. But her interpretation requires the same kind of justifications and reasons that yours would. And they're almost kind of on the same level. People are like, what? What do you mean? Shouldn't the author have special say over it? And what we say in rhetoric, just like what you say in composition, is once the pen leaves the page, the author is now a critic of this text that exists out there. Just like how
Mhm.
a recording of a speech, Obama could watch his own speech and say, "Oh, I was meaning to do this, or I failed at this." He's critiquing the speech. He's not saying what really happened. He doesn't have privileged access. I think you're absolutely right. Like intent doesn't matter that much. But I would say in the Musk case, what's interesting is these defenses are not the typical intent defenses. Like he's like, oh no, I did that gesture, but it's not the symbolic one. Right? I was excited. I'm doing it. Or he was like, I did a different one. I did the Roman salute. Okay. Or he's like, or I'm, he's autistic. He's just making these gestures and he's unaware of the context and the history of how it plays in social settings because of autism. So I see what you're saying, but it's a much different flavor kind of intent defense than we would traditionally see here. But maybe it
Yeah.
is an intent defense. It's something I have to kind of think through a bit more because it is kind of fresh. But I'm kind of like just kind of shaking my head and kind of laughing at it because I'm like, it's such a wild. Like we're only what 3-4 days into the presidency, and we already have this massive rhetorical, like high energy rhetorical thing going on. That's crazy. I'm like, wow, we got 4 more years of this.
Yeah.
And this is day 4. Wow, there's gonna be a lot of stuff to study.
Yeah. I don't. Yeah. The autism defense. I don't know. I have to think about that. I mean, I'm autistic, and I've never done that before, and I've been pretty
Mhm.
excited. But
Yeah,
I have.
I feel
I
like
don't.
the defense of it so far has been um, that it's a real savage misunderstanding of autism and really kind of insulting to autistic people. That's what I've been seeing people say about it.
Mhm.
Like, first of all, can you really group autistic people into a big group like this and say that they're unaware of what genocide is? I think that's probably not only incorrect, but kind of a gross stereotype of autism. That's what a
Right.
lot of the defense is being saying. That's what I think too. But a lot of the defenses have been like, don't throw autistic people under the bus and don't use them as an excuse for your ignorance.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Um. Okay. Can you? Okay. Rhetoric is the history of rhetoric. Rhetoric often begins in ancient Greece. You
Mm-hmm.
kind of talked a little bit about that with Plato.
Yeah.
But can you maybe talk a little bit about the sophists and how rhetoric as a discipline and a practice came about?
Yeah, sure. So the rhetoric, the way we teach it in the universities, and the way most people who are speech comm rhetoricians who regularly attend RSA and NCA would root the practice of rhetoric in ancient Greece, ancient Athens specifically, as where it starts, because that's where we get the word rhetoric from, is from that dispute between the Platonists or the Socratics, depending on what you want to call them. Some people, call it Socratic still, but a lot of people are kind of, maybe it's Plato. We don't know if Socrates would agree with his own characterization. We have other works that talk about Socrates, but not to the detail that Plato takes us into it. But one argument would be, well, if Plato was circulating these things at the time and they were gross mischaracterizations, there would be a lot of texts that would challenge his understanding of what Socrates was like. That might be part of it. Another defense the other way would say, well, the Platonists, the people who were Plato's friends and who were devotees of Socrates or this Socratic idea, were kind of like cultists and kind of like conspiracy nuts. And so they hid so many copies of these works in different places that they survived, whereas other best-selling things would not. It's like one book that's a good example of this. One book that's referenced is the sophist Thrasymachus wrote this book called Knockdown Arguments, and it was a metaphor of wrestling moves and rhetorical moves. Like, what a best-selling book for Athens. Like, take the two most favorite things, like wrestling and rhetoric. These are Athenians' favorite stuff. And you write a book combining them together. It's like, oh, if you could write like a book like today where you talk about Taylor Swift and Harry Potter in some combination, like that would fly off the shelves. It's the same kind of thing. So that we don't have any copies of that, but we know it was a popular book because people are quoting it all over the place, even in the Roman era. They're quoting Thrasymachus, right? Um, so a sophist, sophos is the ancient Greek word for wise, and the sophists were just this group of foreigners. None of them were Athenian, who made their money teaching people how to be good civic agents. like being able to argue with others, express their opinion, give political speeches, things like that. But from Plato's account of the sophists, Plato hated them so much. He wrote almost every one of his books is titled after a sophist. And it's an attempt for Socrates to just own them and savagely drag them around. But sometimes he's more successful than other times. But each of them has a specialty. So we learn that Prodicus, his specialty is using the right word at the right time. And Protagoras, his specialty is I'm going to teach you how to be a good citizen and manage your affairs, and how to be respectful to other people using words. And Hippias is like my art is how to like not waste anything and reuse things and make sure that things are properly recycled is the word we use today. But Hippias is found by Socrates like finding all this stuff people have thrown away and making clothes out of it and stuff like that. He's like very resourceful. And Gorgias is like I can teach anyone how to answer any question about anything, regardless of whether they know it or not. And that's the famous comparison of where Socrates asked Gorgias, if one of your students or one of Hippocrates' students applied for the job of doctor, who would get it? And Gorgias is like, well, my student would, of course. And Socrates is like, don't you think that's a problem? And Gorgias is like, no, it's not a problem. But that's what I teach. And it's like, wouldn't we be better off with an actual doctor and not a wordsmith as the doctor? And he's like, it's not really, Gorgias is like, it's not really like Gorgias can't imagine a world where people would be so unethical as the one that Plato and Socrates paint in the Gorgias dialogue. He just really can't imagine people not knowing the difference between right and wrong. And he thinks it's such an easy problem that when he's asked, he's like, but what if a student did come to you and didn't know the difference between right and wrong ethically or right and wrong in terms of an Athenian way of life? Gorgias is like, well, I suppose I would have to teach him that too. And you can imagine from the crowd, this would have gotten a laugh because Gorgias being Italian and the audience being Athenian, they would be like, oh, okay, that's funny. He thinks our way of life is like so easy to master. And he's kind of shown it through his mastery of Greek and all this. It would be kind of a humorous line. But they took money for teaching people how to speak, which was something that you kind of needed. There's no lawyers, there's no teacher, there's no professional class of teachers, no professional class of lawyers in ancient Athens. So if you're accused of a crime, you defend yourself. So we have a lot of extant texts of legal defense speeches in capital cases that were written by sophists that they would have been paid to write. They write, and then they would teach it to their client. They would teach, here's how to say it, and look this way, and move your arm this way, kind of like what we do in speech with undergrads. We're like, no, don't look at your notes so much, or look up a bit more, and move over here. You can move while you're speaking. It makes it better. And this kind of stuff was seen as illusion by Plato, pure illusion, and a distraction from the reality of things. And that was his big issue to take with it. Now, in the West and in the United States, where rhetoric is most commonly taught and where we have a lot of degree programs for it, there are rhetoricians in Japan, but most of them have been trained at PhD programs in the United States. Canada has its own rhetoric society, which is fantastic, and they produce great stuff. And they're a combination of philosophers and some classicists too. Super interesting stuff. They just recently did the Canadian Society of Rhetoric just recently did a Zoom conference at the beginning of December about the sophists, or about rhetoric, and I think it was about the sophists if I remember. I listened to a few of those papers. Great stuff. So it is kind of a more worldwide thing, but the attention, sometimes people critique the attention on Athens, and they say, well, what about Rome? And in graduate school, I had a professor who was like, well, Rome is just derivative of what they did in Athens, which I think some people might find to be valid argument. But there are parts of Roman rhetoric that I think are worth separating and studying most acutely, because the people who are called the founding fathers of the United States they knew Latin, they studied Latin in school, and they mostly read and translated Cicero. So their idea of a republic comes from Cicero, who was a big leader in Rome and a big advocate for the Roman Republic and the Roman Senate, and eventually was executed for not playing ball with the empire, with the shift to the empire. So understanding Roman rhetoric and understanding how Rome constituted itself rhetorically I feel like is a little bit underestimated when trying to understand what the founding fathers wanted the United States to look like. Now you might say, I don't really care what the founding fathers thought. That's fine. But there are these like 9 people in black robes in Washington, D.C., who the majority of think they can understand what the founders wanted the country to do and decide our rights based on that. And they don't look at Cicero. They don't look at Roman conceptions of the Republic. They're just imagining what the founders might have thought. I mean, we kind of know what they thought. We can go and look at their letters and be like, oh, yeah, Cicero says this, Cicero says that. So there's a scholarly line there that the Supreme Court justices either are ignorant of, which I find hard to believe, or they just don't want to follow for whatever reason, probably because it would curtail some of their power of being the interpreters of the founding fathers' minds. Like, we know what they thought. Go look it up. Go read the Federalist. But in the Federalist, you even see references to things Cicero would argue of why a republic is better than a confederation. Like, these are some of Cicero's arguments. And that's coming from, the focus on Latin, and, you're translating this stuff, but you're also reading and thinking about it too. So I think that's an importance for that. And then the last thing I'll say on this is that there has been really good work done on Chinese rhetoric, Indian rhetoric, like Indian subcontinent rhetoric, Aboriginal rhetorics. There's stuff out there. People are doing this kind of work. And really importantly, First Peoples rhetorics, like Native people around the globe. And I think these are interesting rhetorical traditions that get blown over through this kind of like romantic attachment we have to like the democratic scene, or the democratic exposition, where someone is standing there in a white toga and these marble pillars and making arguments about what we should do as a society. I mean, I think it's a very romantic image, but we also have other romantic images that they don't match our understanding of the democratic narrative in that way. Other romantic images of the Confucian scholar in the garden talking about appropriateness and manners and what it is to be a good son or a good minister. We also have, we could have images of the Indian philosophers doing the same thing. Or Buddhist rhetorics. That's an interest of mine as well. You think about these guys walking across the Khyber Pass with all these books, going to Tibet to try to educate the rulers of Tibet. They should be Buddhist. And so that's a romantic image too. So I think it's just a matter of like turning the attention away from that tradition and maybe creating some new traditions there too. But people have done it. There's a old president of NCA wrote a great book about Indian and Near Eastern rhetorics. I think his name was Oliver. That was written in like the 50s or 60s. Herbert Fingerette wrote a great book on Confucian rhetoric. It's a very slim book, but it's really brilliant. I mean, part of it is, when you have people going to PhDs in for speech comm rhetoric, there's not really an emphasis on language or history there in those PhD programs, because the tradition is in English and it's written by Americans, and it's kind of written pulling these things in and saying, hey, Marx is rhetorical and this is rhetorical. But it might be, that might be the reason why there's such a focus on Athens. But then you don't have to take Greek or Latin either. A little bit goes a long way, as someone told me in graduate school. Like, I took classical Greek. I took a couple of semesters of it because I thought it was kind of important to kind of be able to say that you knew what you're talking about and go and look at the stuff and make sure we had it right. They're like, a little bit goes a long way. You should need a few words. I was like, wow, okay. So it's a very Amerocentric, a very English-centric kind of field in speech comm. And I wonder what it would look like if we took seriously the idea of multiple rhetorics. That's the old battle between John Polakis and Schiappa, Ed Schiappa. Was rhetoric invented in Athens, or did the Athenians articulation of rhetoric is just the one that we like the best? Because obviously, if you think rhetoric is that important and that constitutive to human communication, you would say, well, every culture has a rhetoric then. And that's kind of the fight they had. Was rhetoric invented by the ancient Greeks, or was that just their word and their conversation for something that every culture invents? The Schiappa Polakis debate. People still refer to it. I don't know if it's still current, but
I'll have
it's
to check that
kind of
out.
along the lines of what I was talking about.
Yeah, no, that's pretty interesting. Yeah, I'm really happy you brought that up too. I was trained, all the rhetorical training I've had from rhetorical theory was from, ancient rhetoric from ancient Greece, ancient Rome. And I find it really interesting. But yeah, it is. I do have a lot of room to do further research in
Mm-hmm.
yeah, all different kinds of rhetoric.
Yeah, I would hope that NCA and RCA and maybe even the four Cs would open up some space for this kind of, rhetorics, non-English derived rhetorics. There are people out there doing this work. But it's not to say that Roman and Greek rhetoric isn't powerful and awesome and interesting. I teach all that stuff too. I teach all that, but then occasionally I'll throw in, like, this guy Daniel Perdue has written a book about Tibetan Buddhist debate. And so I'll throw some of that in there too, about how did they think about argument? How did they think about argument in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition?
That's
And the
cool.
students kind of like it. Yeah, it's kind of funny. They kind of like it because it's really weird and different to them. They're like, oh, this is kind of funky. Like, what is this? Kind of weird. And it doesn't look like debate to them. And also the way that they proceed in the debate is not the way we think of debate in the American cultural tradition. So I think things like this are pretty interesting. There is an NCA, just to be fair to NCA, there is a Chinese communication division, I think, and I've been to some of their panels. It's interesting, but it's a lot more media studies than it is like, you know, political rhetoric in China and things like the parlay and all these old things. There's still traces of these old cultural practices still in Chinese culture and Japanese culture, whatever culture you pick. There's going to be these ancient ways of like appropriateness. What's an appropriate way to talk to people? And then that is a begged question. It's like, well, how old are they? What's their class? What's their gender? How educated are they? What's our situation? What am I trying to? All these things would answer the question of appropriateness, which I think sometimes the older I get, the more I think appropriateness is the more central question in rhetoric than persuasion. Because I think a lot of young
Yeah.
people are like, oh, rhetoric's about persuasion. It's about making arguments and making arguments stick. And I'm like, yeah, there's some truth to that. But the richer and more deep rhetoric understanding is appropriateness. What's appropriate to say right
Mhm.
now? And I think that's a richer question for research.
Mhm. Yeah. No, I'm really happy you brought that up. I have been for a while trying to find a job in communications related stuff, and a
Mhm.
question I kept getting asked was, what does effective communication look like to you? And my first thought was always, is it appropriate for the purpose, and does it address the needs, the beliefs, and the values, expectations of the audience? And that's what you need. And so all the
Mhm.
other things are going to depend on that. And so I was kind of had difficulty because I'm like, I can't just say that. I have to say
Yeah.
more if I want
Right.
the
Right. Right.
job. So
That is
yeah,
tough. That's a
yeah,
tough one. And also, like, what happens when those things are at cross purposes? Because you're like, okay, I understand what the situation requires and what's appropriate, but I also understand what the audience needs. But if I give the audience what they need, they're going to be like, what the hell is this? This isn't, this isn't a training. What is this guy doing? And
yeah,
I think this is probably the most relevant example I can think is like people who do DEI trainings probably face this quite a bit because they're doing a workplace training and everybody has an appropriateness model for workplace training. And then the DEI person comes in and mixes it up and makes them do uncomfortable things they didn't expect to do. And they're like, they might need that, but then they're like, well, this isn't a training. What is this? And they don't
yeah,
recognize it. So it's a difficult line to dance, I think.
yeah, definitely. Mhm.
Mhm.
You've mentioned political rhetoric decent amount. I want to segue into that, but
Mhm.
before we get into that, to kind of outline a few things. Aristotle distinguished between three types of discourse: deliberative, hypodeictic, and judicial. So
Mhm.
can you outline what exactly Aristotle was talking about with these types of discourses?
Yeah, sure. So Aristotle in his book Rhetoric is kind of outlining for his Greek students, his Athenian students, how to engage in political discourse, how to engage in speaking to groups of people. But he also wrote this book, Politics, and that's his analysis of politics, which is a very different kind of thing. But it has cool rhetoric implications in there too. So the thing that everybody pulls from Aristotle's rhetoric is this idea of the three modes of proof: logos, ethos, pathos, and then along with it comes judicial, epideictic, and deliberative. So what he's doing is kind of creating a grid of like, here are the different ways you can prove things, and then here are the different situations you find yourself in when you're speaking. You're either Judicial, you're making a judgment on something. You're saying something is reality. So I think a good forensic topic would be something like we'll just take one that would be like American contemporary. You'd be like, the healthcare system is really messed up. The healthcare system is unfair. American healthcare hurts people more than it helps them. Stuff like that. That'd be like a forensic judgment. And the way that that argument would go is you'd have to define a lot of terms and provide a lot of evidence to kind of make an indictment. So I think that's the judicial form of rhetoric or forensic is you're making an indictment of something, you're indicting something. So recently there's this book that's been very popular, talked about a lot in the press called The Anxious Generation about mobile phones and social media and how it has created a lot of mental illness in young people. And this would be like a forensic speech topic would be the thesis of this book, which is mobile phones and social media are to blame for the poor mental health of the young generation, the Gen Z and the Gen Alpha people in our society. And so that would be an example of that. Epidictic discourse is about values. And it's also Aristotle says judicial is about the past. You're making judgment on the past. So if you want to say, Joe Biden was our worst president, that would be like a forensic thing. If you wanted to say something about the epidictic, you would say something like, well, Joe Biden was a better president than George W. Bush. And so that requires us it sounds like a judgment in the past, but actually it requires us to bring forward some values and value conflict of, well, what do we value in a president? And that's about the here and now. So we might say, well, then we valued this, now we value that, so Biden was better. And this would be the way that argument would go. So epidictic is also about celebration. And for the history of epidictic rhetoric, a lot of times it was just viewed as celebratory rhetoric, like the July 4th speech or the wedding toast or something like that. But it's in the work of Keim Perlman and Ulrich Stidicke that they make, I think, very powerful and correct argument that the epidictic discourse is where we go to find all of the roots of our big arguments in politics and deliberative work. So we go to these are kind of like the places where the wells are dug for the most powerful arguments. It's like, why do we celebrate this day? So like an inaugural address, Trump just gave his inaugural address. We would say that's an epidictic speech. I mean, it's much more complicated than that, but that's what a simple speech textbook would say. It's like a speech saying, this is an important day. Here's why it's important. Here's what we value. Here's what we're about. Here's what we stand for, this kind of thing. But through this, you get the articulation, new articulations and re-articulations of our shared values as a community, as a people, and that kind of thing. So it can be argumentative, but it's argumentative in a different way. Who are we? What do we stand for? What are our important values? And then the final one is deliberative, which is about, well, what are we going to do about this? Like future action, future issue. So these are in public speaking classes, we talk about this as the policy speech. So make a speech where you discuss what we should do to kind of solve a problem. It's kind of the generic way it's done. But deliberative speeches are also like questions about like, how should you pick, who you have children with, and how should you raise your children, and how much time should you spend watching Netflix? These are all deliberative kind of speech topics people don't think about. Or how do you get a better night's sleep? It's like not very political, that doesn't require the Federal Reserve, right? Or maybe
Right.
if you listen to too many Federal Reserve podcasts, it keeps you up at night, maybe you should stop. So, it's this kind of thing, right? So it can be very simple kind of policy. Like, you hear I actually hear some pretty good deliberative speeches about like students who are really like real gym rats, and they'll be like, how do you start working out? Here's some simple exercises you can do. And you should do them when you wake up or maybe but not before you go to bed. I'm like, this is all very deliberative rhetoric. What should we do? But it's often couched in terms of the hyper political. But the micro political is super important too. Like sometimes students will be like, how to make here's how to eat vegan, eat better. Like I've always had students talk about meatless Monday, like if we just didn't eat meat on Monday, it would make a big impact to the world environment. And everybody's always like, they really enjoy, they ask a lot of questions. They think about this. It's new to a lot of students. So, yeah, that's what Aristotle meant by those three things. But I also think it's interesting to think about those in terms of, because that was speech. That was the work of the rhetorician for a long time, for probably a generation in this country, was saying, okay, what kind of speech is it? Is it forensic, epideictic, or deliberative? And then what proof did they use? Logos, ethos, pathos. And they would just graph that and then write a paper. Be like, FDR's fireside chat, go. And this counted as rhetorical scholarship. So it's a very thin, very kind of like almost comic kind of analysis of speech,
Yeah.
which I think was undermined by several scholars, but most of them saying the same thing, which is, Aristotle really wasn't a speech critic. He was trying to teach people how to engage in the political. He's a teacher of it. He really wasn't saying use this to analyze. It was like, here are the tools at your disposal to make speech. It's not really a critical frame, but people still use it as a critical frame even to this day. And there's better tools for that, I would say.
Um, okay, yeah. So I I started reading Perelman and Ulbricht Teka's the new rhetoric, and I
Mm-hmm.
saw that they were really big on the epidectic
Mm-hmm.
uh, discourse of speech, and I thought that was really interesting because
Mm-hmm.
during when I was finishing my master's, I focused heavily on two scholars, Isabella Fairclough and Norman Fairclough, who
Mm-hmm.
focused on they analyzed political discourse in terms of as being fundamentally deliberative, but
Mm-hmm.
you think it's ipodectic. So I was wondering if you could just talk about your view. Um, yeah, just exploring what it means to look at political discourse from an ipodectic lens.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. How should I start with that? Well, I think a lot of times, when you're looking at a form of discourse and you're saying, well, it's fundamentally this or fundamentally that, you're not necessarily wrong, but you're closing off the kind of analysis that rhetoricians would do. Like the Fairclough, they're good. They write some interesting stuff. I've read a lot of their work, but it's not what a rhetorician would do. Like I said earlier, rhetoricians are about complicating matters, not sort of doing this kind of like traditional scholarly work where we're being reductive. Not reductive. I don't want to say reductive, I don't want to get a negative connotation there, but I mean going through all the options and then making a claim and saying this is the best way to understand it because the facts and the reasoning is behind it. That's one way to do scholarship. I think really good when I think about favorite rhetorical criticism, it's always complicating matters. It's always making things more cloudy, more complex. And I think when you're talking about serious stuff like political deliberation, like you have these pretty terrible bathroom bills for transgender people, stuff like that. It's like pretty serious. So people's lives are going to be on the line and stuff like that. So this stuff I think requires a complication of the arguments rather than saying what's fundamentally this or fundamentally that. So with that being said, I'd say the epideictic um, realm helps complicate things like that because we could say, where is it that people are drawing? Because you might do a Toolman analysis on some of these arguments and say, I'm not really finding where people are drawing such a strong warrant here. Well, what Perlman and Ulbricht's Titica allow us to do is go back and look at more of the celebratory speeches of what it means to be American or what it means to be. I mean, on the down low, we don't really have a lot of speeches like how great it is to be straight or how great it is to be cis. But you could say, well, implicitly, lots of the discourse celebrates this, and it celebrates it in this epideictic way, and we're getting a lot of that dumped on us. So it makes it much easier for people to make these kind of policy arguments. Even though under a Toolman analysis, we might say, wow, it's much more compelling to allow people to not have these bathroom ban bills because they're so threatening, they're dangerous. All these things make more sense. But why are those arguments not winning the day? When you look at under Toolman analysis, you look at the pro bathroom restriction arguments, and they have very weak warrant, very weak backing. And the reason why is because they're looking at it as purely deliberative, and they're not taking into account the epideictic, which would be that celebratory discourse of our values, which can come implicitly through kind of a waterfall of different kinds of things, not just pop culture, but advertising, comments that people make to the side here and there. So that would be one distinction, one way that I would think about doing it like that. I mean, you can certainly go. I mean, there's plenty of things that have been written about Frederick Douglass's "What is the Fourth of July to a Slave" speech. Great speech, epideictic to the core. And that could be an analysis of like, well, here are some of the argumentative resources being made here. Because, Ulbricht's Titica and Perlman say, well, it's a wellspring. It's a place where we go draw the water for when we make our serious policy appeals. We draw the water from our shared values, and those have to be kind of kept charged. It's like charging a phone. You use your phone to make all this text and stuff like that, but if you don't plug it in and charge it, it's not going to work. So that's the way to think about epideictic from their point of view, is like, this is where they get the charge. This is where they get the energy. It's from these things. And it's a good reason to kind of go and look at the epideictic when it's being celebrated, because implicitly a lot of these things, in terms of people being convinced, they're coming at us from a Burkean mode, not a logical reasoning mode. They're coming at us from identification or division. I'm not one of those people. I'm not a lib. I'm not a snowflake. I'm not a fascist, right? It comes from division identification. And that is, you can of course look at these arguments from a Toolman point of view. But then when you look at the warrant and the backing and the evidence, you're like, I don't get it. There's something else happening here in the background. And I would say it's that amazing amount of pressure from the epideictic that just doesn't get looked at as a serious part of political discourse.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Recently, I think it's relatively recent, you had a little bit of fame on YouTube from making videos about Joe Biden.
Yeah.
Can you maybe just explain what you said, why it was popular, what people were saying in the comments, all kinds of stuff like that?
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So what happened was I watched the June 27th debate, and then I was just really shocked. Like, I had a visceral emotional reaction to the media's characterization of Joe Biden's performance. And I'm like, did they just not listen to what Donald Trump said? Did they not listen to what Joe Biden said? It was like, old guy is old. And then the media just started calling it a disastrous performance. And I'm like, what? I felt like I was being gaslit by the entire media about what I was like, no, maybe I didn't see the debate. Maybe I missed something. But I was like, no, I really do think Joe Biden performed so well in that June 27th debate, but he had a cold and he was really old. And so he was stammering. He didn't make a lot of sense at some of his, but he had the arguments and he had the receipts. He was giving the basics of deliberative democracy, reasons and justification. But Trump would just be like, you should be in jail for what you did. What? Okay. We don't know what's on your son's laptop. Okay, great. Yeah, we've heard that line many times. You're a weak Palestinian. I thought that line was horrific. Joe Biden, Donald Trump called Joe Biden. He's like, you're like a weak Palestinian yourself. This horrible racist claim. The media said nothing about it. They were like, and so I was really frustrated with this. So I went and made the video. I probably should have cooled off a little bit in hindsight before I made that video, because I was a little animated. It wasn't necessarily like my best kind of scholarship. But that video blew up because people were so convinced that what they had seen about Joe Biden's performance was a person who had dementia. And in part of the video, I'm like, we're not able to diagnose this. It's a trick for us. The only thing we can look at is the debate. We can look at the words, and then it just fell flat. I think most of the comments, like that video, is very unpopular, but ironically, it has more comments and more views than a lot of my other videos, but it has so many dislikes.
Oh, I
Tons of
bet.
dislikes, right? But it's a lot of people go out, and I think that people who are pro-Trump have a much better network, and they go around and tell each other about it. And they're like, go downvote this, go downvote this, go give a comment on this, da da da. And then my understanding, I don't have any evidence for this, but my understanding, as I was told by somebody, is that a popular Twitch streamer who's very political showed my video on his stream while playing a game and then talked about it, but he was pro-Biden. And so that got a lot of the comments in there that don't make a lot of sense because they're about this particular video game. So that was done. And then I made a follow-up video where I was like, was my Biden video that bad too? Because I felt like it was like double gaslighting. Because I'm like, I didn't think I said anything unreasonable. But I think the June 27th debate for me really shows like it shows two things. One, how incredibly bad rhetorical education is in the country, where we can't even watch a debate and look at what people said and take it away from intent or away from the people and say, okay, who made the best arguments? That should at least be one part of how we evaluate the debate. We could also say your performance was weak. You weren't a strong speaker. This is how it's done in high school classrooms and college classrooms across the country. But the American media couldn't even be bothered to do that basic level of analysis. and give President Biden that little bit of credit. They couldn't even talk about the credibility of him showing his accomplishments and why his accomplishments matter. And then the second thing it shows is that our fact-based politics is a huge failure because it's still it's a convenient thing. So we have all these fact checkers and factometers and all this stuff on every website. Whenever there's a political debate, we have the fact checkers go through it. Well, where are the fact checkers for that debate? The media couldn't climb over the fact checkers fast enough to say this old guy is like he's like crumbling, he's losing his mind, he's like unstable. They had to make that story. So the reliance on facts to judge a debate is just as arbitrary as relying on appearance. In fact, it's just another form of appearance. What's the way out of this? Rhetoric, where you can say reason giving and justification can be evaluated on a different plane from all these things through rhetorical training. We have the long history of it. We have the theory. It's done in high school and junior high classrooms do that. They're like, well, your presentation was bad, but you had good research. Every junior high English teacher in the country has said this to a student, and it's beneficial. But when we come to our national political debates, we can't say that. It's baffling to me.
Yeah. No, I thought that video was very interesting because I'll watch as you post videos. I really enjoy your videos, and I watched that one. And
Thanks.
I was like, yeah, I feel like I agree with this. And I checked the comments. I was like, what's going on? Like,
Yeah, you feel immediately gaslit.
I will say though, I never thought your tone or anything was like more animated, unnecessarily animated. I thought it was perfectly fine. So I wouldn't stress about that.
Okay, good. I was a little fired up because I'm like, I can't be crazy.
Yeah.
Like I watched this debate. I thought Biden like made the best case in that debate, but he's an old man.
Yeah. Okay. I have one more question before we get to the speed round questions.
Okay.
Can you talk about your interest in rhetoric and video games?
Yeah, sure. So, um, I've always thought that it would be kind of fun to teach a course on video games and rhetoric. And one of them I thought of as video games as political. And that interest came from a long ago controversy that goes back to the Columbine high school shooting in the 90s, in 98, 99, Columbine high school shooting. It was like kind of like the paradigmatic one where people were like, oh, these two guys who shot up the school and killed themselves and killed a lot of people, killed teachers. It was like one of the earliest school shootings, so it was a really big deal. Oh, they were listening to Marilyn Manson and playing violent video games. And so this led to like, this critique of media as being unduly influential on these young men. And then a video game came out at that time called Super RPG Maker. And it was one of these games where you can make your own Final Fantasy style role playing game. And a guy they had a contest and they were like, if you make a great RPG and it's upvoted by the fans on our website, we will give you a reward. And this guy made one called Super Columbine Massacre. And he basically just retold the day. You play as the shooters and you go through the day putting pipe bombs in the locker, getting the guns. You go through your day and you plan it out, and then you go through everything the media reported happens in this game. But you have choices. You're being the characters. So you go from room to room and you complete the quests. And it's kind of a very simple game. And this game was like highly, highly voted up. You know how the internet does. Everybody's voting it up. And then the company was like, well, this is a public relations nightmare, so they should cancel the contest. But the creator of this game went on the media, and he was very happy to talk to media. And they were like, don't you think what you're doing is just terrible? That's terrible. It's influential. He's like, if I had written a fictional kind of narrative where I kind of went into the events of it, I would be praised. I might even win a book award. If I made a documentary, I might win a documentary award. If I wrote a piece of long form journalism, I might win an award. Why is a video game so different? Why isn't a video game like another form of media? And that really stuck with me. The interview with this guy. I don't remember his name or anything about it, but that stuck with me. And I thought, wow, that'd be cool to do a class where you talk about the politics of video games. And since then, there have been all kinds of controversial video games. Most recently, there was a game made by somebody called School Shooter, where you either play as the school shooter or you play as the cops. And that got pulled from Steam very quickly. And people are arguing, well, this is a literary way of working through these things, very much like historical fiction or a novel would, something that might win a prize. So I was interested in that. So then my first attempt at really doing any scholarship on it, I haven't taught the class yet, but I thought it'd be cool because we could do like Papers, Please and This War of Mine. There's all these political games you could do in the class, and that might be a way of working through some of these controversies, just like having a debate in the class or having somebody write a paper would be. So I thought, okay, that could be interesting. But scholarly, I got interested in it because I saw a call from a really smart guy, great composition English guy named Mike Piero. Really smart guy, great writer. He's a machine too. He's putting out fiction and poetry and scholarly work, and he's got like a kid. And I mean, I don't know how he does it, but he put out a call that they wanted to put together a book on the video game Skyrim. And Skyrim is near and dear to my heart. It's one of my favorite games of all time. So I threw my hat in the ring. I was like, "Hey, Mike, I don't know you or anything, but here's an abstract. What do you think?" And that was my first video game piece, and it's in that book by McFarland Press called "Being Dragonborn," which I think is a cool title. And all the pieces in there are great. I think it's a great example of video game journalism or video game scholarship that reads like super interesting journalism. It really is insightful. So like, even if you're not a scholar, you pick up that book, it'll make you think about Skyrim in a very different way, like as a piece of art maybe, or maybe as something interesting, like reading a fictional book where a character confronts a big political issue that we might face today. So I thought that was very cool. And then from there, I have a friend, a colleague, who works in the game studies program, game and media studies program at Malloy, Dr. Sarah Evans, and she reached out to me and was like, we should co-author something. And she writes game studies and video game stuff all the time. And so we wrote a piece. I was really interested in this. I'm always interested in slang and what we might call vernaculars in the rhetoric field. There's lots of books about the vernacular. And I was always interested in this word tryhard. What does it mean to be a tryhard? People accuse each other of that all the time. So Sarah and I did a deep dive on this word, what's its etymology, and we wrote the paper talking about how tryhard actually has these racist origins. It's actually a racist slur that was used in Twitch. And actually Twitch underwent a big controversial fight among some of their biggest streamers, Twitch management, and the original creator whose icon was used as the original tryhard icon. Had a big exchange, and it's still not clear what the solution is. Even big streamers like Hassan Piker got involved in this controversy. He's about as big as they come. So we wrote about that, and we gave our suggestions about how this kind of thing could work when memes kind of turn racist or turn bad, and when phrases turn this way, how to police them. And we published that essay, and it's been cited a lot. And so we're very happy with that. But I'm still very interested in video games. I always want to write about video games. What I would really like to do is write about one of the earliest video games, which is a game called Adventure. It was written, I think, at Berkeley in this 1970s or something. Somebody wrote it and put it on the supercomputer on the shared, tape drive or whatever. And they put it up there, and then they sent everyone out, hey, I wrote this game Adventure. See if you like it. And then the Christmas break happened. When they came back, almost every supercomputer, every computer, mainframe computer at every big university had a copy of Adventure on it, but had been tweaked. So I kind of want to talk about this in like the rhetoric of modding and modding communities. We think of it as a new thing, but it's not, right? It's not really. I think that's so cool. So I'd like to write about that. I have a lot of other interesting video game ideas. But that's just kind of, and then I got a chance, we were hiring, and I got a chance to interview somebody who's really into game studies who now works out at PLU out in Tacoma, Washington. And I think it's really rich and cool, like video games and game study stuff. There's a lot going on there, especially like rhetoric of coding, like the other side of it. Like, what is it like to work at a software lab and code these video games? What's it like to design video games? there's a lot of good rhetorical work to be done there too. So I guess for now, I'm just kind of writing what I'm writing. Not really writing a video game piece right now, but I really should. But it's on the back burner. And then trying to get a class together, like rhetoric of video games, would be kind of fun. I think students would like that. I'll be like, no book, just get a Steam account, buy these games, and then we'll just kind of work through them and see if we can rhetorically analyze them or use them as elements of invention or something. I don't know. It's kind of loose.
No, that's exciting. That sounds really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I'll have to tell you more another time, but I've been interested in rhetorical analyses of video games for a bit. I took
Mm-hmm.
it was a language and literacy course on video games, and one of the papers was kind of building upon Ian Bogost's procedural rhetoric.
Yeah.
So, and I was just like,
Bogost's
this
work is great.
yeah. And so then during my master's, I analyzed Minecraft from a Marxist perspective
Oh,
for a
that's
seminar
great.
paper. Yeah,
I love
using
that.
Bogostian theory, I guess.
I had a friend talk about Heidegger in Minecraft, and
Oh, that's cool.
while presenting, she had built in Minecraft peaceful mode, had built Heidegger's cabin in the path that Heidegger would walk with the trees and stuff, and had little Steve do that walk while she's talking. Do
Yeah,
the
that's
Heideggerian
cool.
walk. It was very, very cool. Kind of. I was just reminded of that. I was like, that was such a cool presentation.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's super cool. That's really great. I like that. Yeah, you made me think of something, but I forgot what I was going to say. That I was like, oh, Minecraft, that's great.
Okay, by the end of the interview, gonna run some quick questions.
Oh, I do remember. Let me say one more thing
Oh
about
yeah,
video
yeah,
games. I
add it.
remember what it is.
Yeah.
So there was recently a guy who in GTA 5 did Grand Theft Hamlet, where he ran around to different areas and then performed Hamlet soliloquies in the video game and did
Oh, that's
that as like
interesting.
an art project. That's interesting. Then there's also a group of Shakespeare enthusiasts who, in the game Fallout 76, put on productions of Shakespeare plays using the costumes and the set and the scenery from Fallout 76, which is a post apocalyptic nuclear wasteland. And they've been sponsored by Bethesda, who makes Fallout 76. Bethesda's given them a lot of resources and been like, we really like what you're doing. What do you need from us? Keep doing what you're doing. And then they film and put these on YouTube.
I need to watch
And
that. That sounds
yeah, but
awesome.
they also want a live audience. They'll advertise it in Fallout, and then Fallout players will come and sit in the audience and watch the production like live.
That's really
It's
cool.
wild, yeah. And some academics have done. A couple of academics have written papers about. They're called the Wasteland Theater Company, but they mostly have done Shakespeare. I don't think they did anything else. They did Richard III was the last one they did.
That's exciting.
Yeah, super cool stuff. So video games is rich, and now they're starting to do that thing where they play around with other media. You know.
Mhm. Okay, run through some quick questions.
Okay, this is the speed round. Okay, I'm ready.
Yeah, speed round. What video games are you currently playing, and do you have a favorite?
I have been playing Fallout 76. I have been playing No Man's Sky. I've been playing Vampire Survivors. And I think my favorite right now is No Man's Sky. I'm just getting a lot out of it. Can't really explain it. I'm just really enjoying it. I think it's because they added fishing. I have this weird theory that once a video game adds fishing, it's top tier.
Okay,
So like Stardew
interesting.
Valley, top tier, you know. Anything with fishing involved, that's a top tier game. That's going to be a class A game, regardless of the other elements. It counts for a lot.
Okay, who is one or more scholars of argumentation or rhetoric that you think others should read?
Um, I think David Zarefsky's work incredibly important. People should read David Zarefsky on argumentation rhetoric. He's the American kind of heart of it. I think Christopher Tyndale's work. He's a Canadian scholar, Canadian philosopher, scholar of argumentation. He wrote a great book called Rhetorical Argumentation. I think that's the title of it. That's a great book because he goes back and forth. He's like, argumentation is rhetorical, rhetoric is and he kind of takes the two different scholarly positions and kind of merges them together and flips them back and forth. It's a great experience. But then he also has a really great book on the sophists that I think is underrated. It's called Reason's Dark Champions, where he defends the sophists from the perspective of the like hardcore philosophical argumentative tradition. Is like, no, they have actually really good, valid, logical arguments here. And it's like, super hard mode to write a book like that because nobody buys that. And he did a good job. I think he did a good job. He really rehabilitated the sophists in the eyes of many people with that book, but I think it's underrated. So I think that's good. And then I think for rhetorical critics, I think Lisa Flores' recent essay about race and rhetorical criticism and the importance of race in our analysis is a must-read essay. I think that essay is like that essay is like was like kind of like a bomb dropping on the field. I think everybody should read that Flores essay about like if you're doing rhetorical criticism, you're not mentioning race. That criticism is not going to be valuable. I mean, it's a hard pill to swallow for a lot of people. For a lot of people, like I'm not a race scholar, and her argument's kind of like, how could you not be?
Yeah. No, I'll make sure to check those out for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, thank you for joining me for the podcast.
Yeah. Hey, I love the invitation. I'm glad we got to finally do this. We're talking about it so long. It's great.
I know.
Great to be
I've
here.
been very busy. So nice talking to you. I'll get back to you soon.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.